In November of 1930, in northern Canada, a fur trapper by the name of Joe LaBelle was searching for shelter. He was on his canoe in Lake Anjikuni, hundreds of miles away from any civilization. In the distance, he saw an Inuit settlement, but as he got closer, it seemed like nobody was there. Entering the village, Joe noticed that the roughly 25 people who had been living there were gone. However, there were many signs that they hadn't just abandoned their village. Food was still hung over an extinguished fire pit. Inside of a tent there was cloth in the process of being sewn, and there were still the remains of a smoldering fire. He also found that many of their rifles and equipment had been left behind. To his horror, he found that the people's huskies had starved to death while they were still tied to their posts. Joe found no indication of a fight or any sign of a struggle within the village. But most surprisingly, Joe found a freshly dug up grave that had been completely emptied. Unnerved, Joe would leave, and he informed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Sergeant John Nelson would lead the investigation. While he and the police were heading to the village, they would come into contact with a trapper named Armand Lormant and his two sons. They claimed that they had seen a bullet-shaped object flying through the sky close to Lake Anjikuni. When police arrived at the village, they confirmed everything Joe had seen. But they also found that every single grave had been dug up and that the headstones had been stacked on top of each other. However, they still found no explanation for why the villagers would leave or where they went. Being that the people of this village lived very remote, there were no official records of them, and they have never been seen again. With all of that, let's get into the theories. Our first theory is that the people had abandoned their village. Typically, Inuit people are nomadic and travel to places with ample hunting. This village in particular was composed of tents, indicating that this may not have been a permanent settlement. Perhaps the people had simply decided it was time to move on, or maybe due to the concern of a disease or an attack. However, if this were the case, why would they leave their supplies behind so suddenly? Most importantly, their dogs, which were a necessity for their survival. This also doesn't explain the graves. Inuit people are very respectful of their dead. Digging up a grave would be considered a disgraceful act. Also, if this was only a temporary settlement, why would there be multiple graves unless they had already been staying there for a long period of time? Our second theory is aliens. With the report from the local trapper Armand, some posit that aliens are to blame for the disappearance. There have also been reports that locals nearby saw lights in the sky near the lake around the time of the disappearance. Perhaps the Inuits had seen aliens and feared for their lives, so they ran off into the cold, leaving behind everything out of fear. Our third theory is that the story is a hoax. A lot of my basis for this theory comes from Brian Dunning's article about the case on his website, Skeptoid. If you remember, Joe LaBelle claims he was canoeing when he found the village. However, in that area of Canada, temperatures get to around negative 15 degrees Celsius in November, and Lake Anjikuni is frozen over for half of the year. So if the lake is frozen over, how could he be canoeing? There are also several reports that say that the lead investigator on the case, John Nelson, released an official report on January 17, 1931. However, no record of this report has ever been publicly posted, yet many people still write about what it said. Let's look at the timeline of the story. Joe LaBelle's story was first published in a newspaper called The Bee on November 27, 1931 in Danville, Virginia, almost 2,000 miles away from Lake Anjikuni. In 1959, 22 years later, Frank Edwards would feature the story in 3 pages of his book, Stranger Than Science. However, in this version, he adds that Joe LaBelle actually accompanied the police back to the village. In November of 1976, Dwight Wallen wrote about the story in an issue of Fate magazine titled Vanished Village Revisited. Wallen had actually contacted the RCMP himself, where he spoke to the commissioner who told him that there are no reports from John Nelson saying he actually went to Lake Anjikuni. 5 months later, a famous reader of Wallen's magazine, Betty Hill, wrote a letter to Wallen. Before moving on, it should be noted that Betty Hill has one of the most famous alien abduction stories ever and was incredibly popular within the extraterrestrial community. In her letter to Wallen, she claims that while she was on a ferry ride near Nova Scotia, she met a man named Captain Larson. He had supposedly spent 9 years studying the Anjikuni village disappearance and came to the conclusion that the entire village had been abducted by aliens. After this, many UFO writers around the world began writing about the Anjikuni village while adding in more false details. The trapper and his 2 sons who had seen a bullet-shaped object flying through the sky was added by Nigel Blundell in his 1983 book. All of the graves being dug up and emptied was added in 2006 by the Canadian UFO report. As for the fire with embers still smoldering, I'm not sure who added that detail, but it wasn't in Joe's original story. All of this implies that the story was fabricated by years of rumors, and with the inconsistencies in Joe LaBelle's original story, he may have lied about it himself. The disappearance of Lake Anjikuni Village is an example of how a story can change over time, especially in the absence of official documentation. There are many sources and videos online that tell a different story. Did Joe LaBelle actually stumble upon the remains of an abandoned village, or was he just telling a tall tale? Unless evidence surfaces proving a story, it will likely remain a mystery.